So the conventional wisdom has been that mass incarceration really begins to take off in the 1980s with the war on drugs and the administration of Ronald Reagan. And when I went into the archives and looked at kind of the longer historical process, I discovered that actually the kind of seeds of mass incarceration and the criminalization of low-income urban Americans begins in an ironic place, which is the height of progressive social change in the US and the Civil Rights Revolution with the Johnson administration. So in response to a wave of unrest in the summer of 1964 in Harlem and Philadelphia and other cities, in March 1965, Johnson calls the war on crime and kind of breaks with 200 years of previous federal policy by establishing a role for the federal government in local police, courts, and prisons for the first time in U.S. history. What's really interesting is he sends this legislation to Congress, and the next week he sends the Voting Rights Act. And the week before he declared the war on crime, he sent the Housing and Urban Development Act, which subsidized private homes for low-income renters. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of the complete civil rights or domestic policy package that the Johnson administration was offering to African Americans. You get housing, a new policing program, and the Voting Rights Act, which of course completed the civil rights, Johnson's civil rights legislation. So we often think of mass incarceration as something that's kind of the natural response to crime on the ground and social problems, or that it was something that just kind of happened. I based my research off of White House Central Files and the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan administrations. And in the Nixon administration, I discovered this document when I was going through Chuck Colson's files, who was one of the officials of the Nixon administration who worked on prisons. And it was this long-range master plan that was something that Nixon actually ordered his Attorney General John Mitchell to devise, working with the Bureau of Prisons, that anticipated for a marked expansion in the nation's penal population. So this document included all of these prison population projections that were based largely on populations that had been made by the Kerner Commission and the Crime Commission, that basically, in the Johnson administration, that basically anticipated that the population of black youth between the ages of 15 and 24, which was the group that federal policymakers believed to be responsible for the majority of the nation's crime, that this group was going to grow at a faster rate than any other group in the United States. And so based on these figures, federal policymakers anticipated that the prison population would grow accordingly and began to plan for that. So in the midst of these projections, the Nixon administration invests $500 million, which essentially amounts to $1.5 billion in today's dollars, in the complete reconstitution of the federal system, and then imposed the kind of goals of this planning document on governors by requiring states through various crime control legislation to dedicate at least 20% of all of their law enforcement funding to corrections. So it basically imposes this administrative priority on states, and as a result, the prison system did indeed expand dramatically during the 1970s, setting the stage for the explosion that we see in the 1980s and 1990s. So the rise of national crime control policies, really beginning in the Kennedy administration with the kind of first federal intervention in low-income urban communities through his anti-delinquency programs, is the outcome of a sets of fears on behalf of national policymakers and the social scientists they consulted about demographic changes in American society. So by the early 1960s, cities like Cleveland, Detroit, were becoming at least a third African American. And Washington, D.C., where policymakers lived, had just come into a black majority. And because of economic realities, this is the era when domestic manufacturing is starting to decline, policymakers say, okay, we've got to do something to address this social dynamite in American cities, that this population of black youth who could potentially explode or revolt. So Kennedy attempts to address that by his anti-delinquency programs. At the same time, Kennedy and other policymakers come to understand poverty, black poverty, not as the result of socioeconomic forces, not as the result of structural exclusion from jobs outside of the service sector, not from underfunded public schools, but because of Black Americans' own pathology. And they're deeply influenced by people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who releases a report in 1965 on the Negro family that basically that recognizes the history of structural discrimination, but that says ultimately Black poverty is the result of this tangle of pathology that has been handed down from one generation of African Americans to the next. And so Johnson's war on poverty, his Council of Economic Advisors says, okay, well, if Black poverty is about pathology, then we can fight a war on poverty relatively cheaply. We don't have to have a major job creation program. We can just, as in the words of Johnson's Attorney General Ramsey Clark, help the disadvantaged help themselves. And as Ramsey Clark went on to say, and I think this really kind of highlights the ways in which this kind of racist thinking about the root causes of poverty seeps into the policies that Johnson and subsequent policymakers developed. Ramsey Clark says, and he's considered one of the most liberal policymakers of his era, he says, for better or for worse, these people, meaning African Americans, are going to be with us, and we had better get them straightened out. And in the end, that straightening out comes in the form of policing programs, comes in the form of police taking larger roles in urban social programs and targeted Black and Latino communities. It doesn't come in the form of a massive redistribution of resources or a Marshall Plan for American cities like Johnson's own Kerner Commission has suggested. I think ultimately policymakers, even during this moment of civil rights revolution, were unwilling to enact the policies and commit the resources necessary to really disrupt the racial hierarchies that have defined the United States historically.